Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Wilkins, the president of our Asala branch here in Minnesota, and it is another wonderful Beyond Black History Month program that Gene and Linda Crump and our Education Committee have put together. Today, we're going to enjoy the American Dream is at the expense of the American Negro, and Alvin and Gene are going to carry it, and we're going to hear Baldwin and this wonderful debate. So let me get out of the way and hand it over to Gene.
Thank you, David. I'd like to introduce Alvin and Hayden, who are members of our committee. And Alvin is going to lead the program, and Hayden is going to support Alvin. And I'd like to turn it over now to Alvin so we can start the Beyond Black History Month program for the American Dream is at the expense of the American Negro. Alvin?
Thanks so much, Gene and David. Appreciate the introduction. As I said, my name is Alvin Stout, and I'm going to be your quasi-host presenter, or someone mentioned a few minutes ago, the conductor of the orchestra that you're going to see. Although this orchestra is going to consist largely of two brilliant orators, James Baldwin and William F. Buckley Jr. But leading into that, I want to tell you a little bit about the theme of this presentation and the theme of the debate that took place here, and why I chose to do this. The resolution that was before the Cambridge Union Society of Cambridge University was a statement: the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. This was a debate that took place back in 1965, and I believe it was February the 18th of 1965. And as I said, it was before the Cambridge Union Debating Society, an organization that had been around since, I believe, 1815. And they were celebrating their 150th anniversary. And they were going to have two individuals who were well-known debate a very sensitive issue, basically an issue that dealt with race relations in the United States. Now you might think, my goodness, why were they having this debate in England rather than having it in the United States? It wasn't like this was done solely because people thought you couldn't do it in the United States, although this was 1965, and race relations was an extremely sensitive issue in 1965. I was 12 years old in 1965, but that was old enough to be aware of what was going on, both by myself and by what my parents had been facing and what we talked about. But as all of you will recall, as I believe most of the people who are in the room today, with perhaps the exception of my wonderful technical assistant, our student intern, Hayden Garbez, were old enough to remember the racial unrest that we were facing in the States in 1965. About a year and a half before this, there had been the March on Washington. And you'll recall this is when civil rights leaders and protesters and demonstrators from throughout the United States, Black and white, came together to march on Washington to say that, you know, we needed a Civil Rights Act in the United States. This discrimination and segregation that was going on in the United States needed to come to an end, and there needed to be legal support behind this. This was the March on Washington where Martin Luther King is so well remembered for his "I Have a Dream" speech. And you'll recall that in that speech, he referred to his dream being a dream that was deeply rooted in the American dream. And of course, the dream he set forth there is all about where people are going to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And, you know, the American dream then and now was always somewhat aspirational, this belief that you could achieve anything in America. You know, the sky is basically the limit if you're willing to work hard, use all of your abilities, all your strengths, all your talents, that the sky was the limit. But was this something that was available to all of its citizens? In 1963 at the March on Washington? No. In 1965 when this debate was going on? No. And this debate was to basically deal with a proposition that the American dream was at the expense of the American Negro. This is the way they would set up debates back then. But before I go any further, let me just make it crystal clear that although I'm your host and your presenter today, I am not professing to be an expert on either Baldwin or Buckley. I have I've actually read most of Baldwin's fiction, most of his novels and his short stories and some of his poetry. I have read a good deal of his nonfiction, also Baldwin having written a great number of essays, and a number of these deal with civil rights, and I have read them. And I have read some biographies and materials by William F. Buckley, and I actually met William F. Buckley when I was in college. Buckley and I are not the same age. I was probably about 19 or 20 years old at the time, and he was in probably his late 40s at that time. And he just happened to be on our campus giving a lecture, and he came by my fraternity house because the president of the conservative club, of which I was not a member, was hosting him. And I met him, talked to him briefly, and the sort of persona I saw in that brief interlude is similar to the sort of the persona you're going to see in this debate. Somewhat aristocratic, but friendly, at least to students at that time. Baldwin, I never met, even though, as I said, I've read quite a bit about him. Although Gene, if we have time at the end, I may add an anecdote, because I believe Gene actually met Baldwin. But let's get back to what we are doing here today. I am going to focus most of my comments leading up to the video we're going to play for you today on a book that was written in 2019 by Nicholas Buccola. It's called The Fire is Upon Us. And it's an entire book that this professor from Linfield College out in McMinnville, Oregon wrote in 2019 about the debate. And he talks at great length about both Baldwin and Buckley. And it's a wonderful book, and it's very, very insightful. So today we're going to show you portions of that debate. Our time is limited because the way we do these programs here at ASALA is we basically have an hour for the presentation. The debate that took place in 1965 for the Cambridge Union allowed two student debaters to come forward initially and argue on both sides of the resolution for about 5 minutes. I'm not going to present that part of the debate to you. They do it initially, and then they let the two speakers, the main speakers who had drawn the crowd for this, Baldwin and Buckley, then speak. And each of them speak for about 25 minutes. Fortunately for us, the BBC had the foresight to actually film this as it was occurring. And thanks to the technology that we have no further than our computers these days and access to YouTube, we are able to actually bring up the videotape of that. They did not tape the debate in its entirety. They did an edited version because they were trying to do a film that they could show on television within basically an hour's time. So the video we're going to show you, focusing just on Buckley and just on Baldwin, is just going to be the edited versions of what the two of them said, which I wish I could give it to you all, but I simply don't have the time. For those of you who would like, though, in this book by Buccola, they actually have the entire transcript of the debate as far as Buckley and Baldwin are concerned, which is well worth reading, as well as the two students who introduced them. There were 6 additional students who were allowed to speak for a few minutes at the end of the debate, but that was not transcribed and that is not on the video. But let me move ahead again, because I know I've got limited time here. As I said initially, we're going to take you back to 1965 when this debate occurred. You may recall that in 1965, the beginning of the year, in January of 1965, Martin Luther King had gone to Selma, Alabama to participate in the demonstrations that were going on there for voting rights. And he had been arrested, as well as a number of other individuals, wrote a letter that ended up in the New York Times, where he talked about the fact that there were more people in jail with him at that time than on the voting rolls in Alabama. You'll also probably recall that in March of 1965, March the 7th, which is just a few weeks after this debate, we have the demonstration where individuals are trying to walk peacefully from Selma to Montgomery. It was going to be a protest march where they were going to go over the Pettus Bridge. And this is the one where Congressman John Lewis, at that time part of SNCC, was leading the march. And as they are peacefully going across the bridge, they are encountered by a number of state troopers who had been emboldened by the then governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who you will remember was the person who talked in terms of, I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, the kind of chilling words that you hate to hear, and that maybe I shouldn't say this, but makes me worry when I hear people here in our own state talk about how we fight woke in the school, woke in the corporations, we'll never surrender to the woke mob. Florida is where people go for where woke died. Those kind of statements coming from governors are very, very chilling. And people of color know too well what can sometimes happen. And Bloody Sunday, I can't go into great length about what happened here, but the peaceful protesters were set upon by troopers on horseback who had tubing wrapped in barbed wires, and they had clubs, and they just beat these people mercilessly. And it was just terrible what they did. And this was just shortly after this. On the very day of the debate itself, there had been some demonstrations also in Alabama, in which an individual was shot in the stomach and ultimately died, trying to protect his mother and his 82-year-old grandfather. These were tough times in Alabama. This debate that we're having in England on that day is focused on, again, this resolution is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro. In this atmosphere where there are more people on in the jail cells than on the voting rolls, and when the Voting Rights Act is still being negotiated in Congress, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had just come in the prior summer, but there were going to be lots of litigation going on in terms of what did that act mean and what were its limitations when it said it was going to end discrimination based on color and on gender and on race and on religion. Just how far did it go? At this time, Buckley and Baldwin were coming for this debate. The purpose of Baldwin even coming to England had been part of a publicity tour for his latest book. Baldwin had written a number of books. Okay, my timer is telling me, the retired litigator, that I've already talked for 12 minutes and I feel like I've only talked for 2. So I'm going to have to speed things up. But this was a publicity tour, and the students at the union were able to convince Buckley to come debate Baldwin. Baldwin's publicity staff had decided that they would do this debate when they went to the union, as well as reaching out to other resources in London and so forth, trying to, say, let's do book signings here, let's do interviews on television and the like. Let's go ahead and do all these things. And they were told, sorry, we at the union, we're a debating society. We don't do book reviews and so forth. But if you're willing to talk about a topic that stems from the writing of Baldwin, we're willing to do it. The book that Baldwin had out, Another Country, was a fictionalized story. And it had very little to do with the civil rights movement. I mean, there were different races involved. There were individuals of different races who were dating each other. There were people of the same gender who were into sexual relationships with each other. The story kind of went all over the place. The book had been somewhat popular in the United States, and they were trying to sell it in England as well. So they said, let's do this debate. But you'll see in this tape that we're going to show you, they never talk about the book or his prior books, Go Tell It on the Mountain or Giovanni's Room or If Beale Street Could Talk. I mean, they don't talk about any of those books. They really are just talking about civil rights. I'm going to ask my assistant, Hayden, to bring up the PowerPoint very quickly. because I'm going to take myself off the screen and we're going to try to look at a few of the things that are on the PowerPoint. I'm going to jump first, if I could, on the PowerPoint. Okay, I know I'm at the point where I have to get to the video, but we're going to start with this. You know, who was James Baldwin? He was a novelist, essayist, literary critic, playwright, and civil rights activist. Let's switch over to number 3. This is David Leeming, who wrote the biography, one of the biographies on James Baldwin. And this description of Baldwin, I think, is something that describes him so well and is a nice setup for what happens in the debate you're about to see. Describes Baldwin was a writer who could combine the cadences of the King James Bible and the Henry James with what he liked to call the best of the African-American culture. His audience was the whole nature, and he incorporated the whole nature into his voice. He was the voice of the wilderness that preached the necessity of touching. In his personal life and his work, he took the side of those who were made into exiles and outcasts by barriers of race, sex, and class, or who turned away from safety and chose the honorable path of tearing down such barriers. But he mourned for those who had created the barriers and had unwittingly allowed themselves to be destroyed by them. And you're going to see that comes up in the course of the debate here, where when Baldwin talks about this issue, he begins by talking about it being one where you really have to look at it from, you know, your point in reality, where you are and who you are. Baldwin being a Black gay man who was born into poverty in Harlem, into a large family. His mother was a single mother at the time she bore him at Harlem Hospital, but she subsequently met a man whose last name was Baldwin. He was not the biological father of Baldwin, but who gave Baldwin his last name, and then had 8 children by that man. So Baldwin was part of a family of 9 children, and he was the eldest in that family. And he faced discrimination both as being Black and as being gay in America, spent time writing his novels not only in the United States, but also over in France and in Turkey. He was born, as I said earlier, in 1924. Following year in 1925, William F. Buckley is also born in New York City, but not in Harlem. He's born down in Manhattan, and he also becomes part of a large family. He is one of 10 children. However, he is not raised in poverty. He has a father who's involved in the oil business in South America, primarily in Mexico and Venezuela, and who's able to give him a lifestyle where he lived on a estate in Sharon, Connecticut that had 47 acres, and he had servants and tutors and was homeschooled by teachers hired by his parents before going off to private school at Millbrook and college at Yale, where he participated not only in debating, but also was the equivalent of the editor of the newspaper at Yale. Leaves Yale, goes into the Army, is actually with the CIA for a while, and ultimately founds one of the leading conservative journals in the United States, National Review, which he edited for decades. But if I keep talking, I'm not going to be able to get to where I want to get to. I'm going to ask that we switch now to slide 15. Okay, I want to show you very briefly some of the things that Baldwin wrote. If we go to slide 16, these are some of his novels that he wrote. As I told you, Go Tell on the Mountain, Giovanni's Room, Another Country. These are all books that he wrote and published successfully before he was 40. We go on to the next slide, slide 17. These are some of the essays that he wrote. I mean, he wrote hundreds of essays. A number of them are available in compilations and so forth if you want to read them. A lot of these can be found on the internet as well. You'll see one of the things I list here is the American Dream and the American Negro, where he did in essay form basically what his argument was before the Cambridge Union. I have some excerpts from the debate that I was going to show you on PowerPoint and read to you, but we simply don't have the time. So we're about to switch over to the actual tape of the debate itself. As I told you a little bit earlier, this began with 2 students speaking, who gave the initial arguments, and they basically cited certain statistics concerning the fact that there were so few individuals of African American descent who actually had the right to vote in the South. But what they tried to argue on the other side is that there were Black Americans who economically were making as much money as whites were making in most of Europe, including Great Britain. After they both spoke relatively briefly, the floor is turned over initially to Baldwin and then to Buckley. It's not like the type of debate some of you may have seen where each side basically gets to go at each other back and forth. No, Baldwin speaks first, and then after the conclusion of his remarks, Buckley is able to speak. So we're going to start now with James Baldwin.
Now we'll bring the voice of actual experience to the debate.
Good evening. I find myself, not for the first time, in the position of a kind of Jeremiah. For example, I don't disagree with Mr. Burford that the inequality suffered by the American Negro population of the United States has hindered the American dream. Indeed, it has. I quarrel with some other things he has to say. The other, deeper element of a certain awkwardness I feel has to do with one's point of view. I have to put it that way. One's sense, one's system of reality. It would seem to me that the proposition before the House, when I put it that way, is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro, or the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro, is a question hideously loaded, and that one's response to that question, or one's reaction to that question, has to depend on the effect on where you find yourself in the world, what your sense of reality is, what your system of reality is. That is, it depends on assumptions which we hold so deeply as to be scarcely aware of them. A white South African, or a Mississippi sharecropper, or a Mississippi sheriff, or a Frenchman driven out of Algeria, all have, at bottom, a system of reality which compels them to, for example, in the case of the French exile from Algeria, to defend French reasons for having ruled Algeria. The Mississippi or the Alabama sheriff, who really does believe when he's facing a Negro boy or girl, that this woman, this man, this child, must be insane to attack the system to which he owes his entire identity. Of course, for such a person, the proposition of which we're trying to discuss here tonight does not exist. And on the other hand, I have to speak as one of the people who've been most attacked by what we must now here call the Western or the European system of reality. What white people in the world, because the doctrine of white supremacy, I hate to say it here, comes from Europe. That's how it got to America. Beneath then, whatever one's reaction to this proposition is, has to be the question of whether or not civilizations can be considered as such equal, or whether one civilization has the right to overtake and subjugate and in fact to destroy another. Now what happens when that happens? Leaving aside all the physical facts which one can quote, leaving aside rape or murder, leaving aside the bloody catalog of oppression, which we are in one way too familiar with already, what this does to the subjugated, the most private, the most serious thing this does to the subjugated, is to destroy his sense of reality. It destroys, for example, his father's authority over him. His father can no longer tell him anything because the past has disappeared, and his father has no power in the world. This means, in the case of an American Negro, born in that glittering republic, and at the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white, and since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skins, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime. So that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is, again, not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It is by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end. Now, we're speaking about expense. I suppose there are several ways to address oneself to some attempt to define what that word means here. Let me put it this way, that from a very literal point of view, the harbors and the ports and the railroads of the country, the economy, especially of the southern states, could not conceivably be what it has become if they had not had, and do not still have indeed, and for so long, so many generations, cheap labor. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I picked the cotton and I carried it to market and I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has until today so much power in Washington, and therefore some power in the world, was created by my labor and my sweat, and the violation of my women and the murder of my children. This, in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And no one can challenge that statement. It is a matter of historical record.
We pause here for a minute, Hayden. I just wanted to point out to you, this was like one of the sections I thought we would refer to before I put the videotape on, where we have Baldwin, he personalizes this in the argument. He makes it very clear from the onset that he is taking this from the perspective of a Black man who has had to deal with this. And he turns it and brings it to the first person when he starts talking about, I picked the cotton and I plowed the fields. The whole image of the American dream is built on the sweat and effort of Black individuals, particularly in the South. Why don't we pick it up again now, Hayden, at 2636.
it was not honored then, I don't have any reason for believing the Civil Rights Bill will be honored now. And after all, one's been there since before, a lot of other people got there. If one has got to prove one's title to the land, isn't 400 years enough? 400 years, at least 3 wars. The American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom or my citizenship or my right to live there, how is it conceivably a question now? And I suggest further that in the same way, the moral life of Alabama sheriffs and poor Alabama ladies, white ladies, that their moral lives have been destroyed by the plague called color, that the American sense of reality has been corrupted by it. At the risk of sounding excessive, what I always felt when I finally left the country, found myself abroad and other places, and watched Americans abroad. And these are my countrymen, and I do care about them. And even if I didn't, there is something between us. We have the same shorthand. I know, when I look at a girl or a boy from Tennessee, where they came from in Tennessee, and what that means. No Englishman knows that, no Frenchman, no one in the world knows that except another black man who comes from the same place. One watches these lonely people denying the only kin they have. We talk about integration in America as though it was some great new conundrum. The problem in America is that we've been integrated for a very long time. Put me next to any African, and you will see what I mean. And my grandmother was not a rapist. What we are not facing is the results of what we've done. What one begs the American people to do for all our sakes is simply to accept our history. I was there not only as a slave, but also as a concubine. One knows the power, after all, which can be used against another person if you've got absolute power over that person. It seemed to me when I watched Americans in Europe that what they didn't know about Europeans was what they didn't know about me. They weren't trying, for example, to be nasty to the French girl or rude to the French waiter. They didn't know they hurt their feelings. They didn't have any sense that this particular woman, this particular man, though they spoke another language and had different manners and ways, was a human being. And they walked over them with the same kind of bland ignorance, condescension, charming and cheerful, with which they'd always patted me on the head and called me shine, and were upset when I was upset. What is relevant about this is that whereas 40 years ago when I was born, the question of having to deal with what is unspoken by the subjugated, what is never said to the master, of having to deal with this reality was a very remote possibility. It was in no one's mind. When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were.
Hayden, let's pause here.
Everyone else.
Okay, we're going to move ahead again. We're trying to save time. I also want to emphasize his comments that he just made there about his own experience, again, where his image of himself was based on what was provided to him in his education, what books were available to him, and that's all he had to learn from. When we think about our own situation today and the books that will be available to our students. Okay, let's go ahead to 3214, Hayden.
That the white world does not know, but I think I do know, is that black people are just like everybody else. One has used the myth of Negro and the myth of color to pretend and to assume that you are dealing essentially with something exotic, bizarre, and practically according to human laws are known. Alas, that is not true. We are also mercenaries, dictators, murderers, liars. We are human too. What is crucial here is that unless we can manage to establish some kind of dialogue between those people whom I pretend have paid for the American dream and those other people who have not achieved it, we will be in terrible trouble. I want to say at the end, at the last, is that is what concerns me most. We are sitting in this room and we are all, at least we like to think we are, relatively civilized. And we can talk to each other at least on certain levels. So that we could walk out of here assuming that the measure of our enlightenment, or at least our politeness, has some effect on the world. It may not. I remember, for example, when the ex-Attorney General, Mr. Robert Kennedy, said that it was conceivable that in 40 years in America we might have a Negro president. And that sounded like a very emancipated statement, I suppose, to white people. They were not in Harlem when this statement was first heard, and did not hear, and possibly will never hear, the laughter and the bitterness and the scorn with which the statement was greeted. From the point of view of the man in the Harlem barbershop, Bobby Kennedy only got here yesterday. And now he's already on his way to the presidency. We've been here for 400 years, and now he tells us that maybe in 40 years, if you're good, we may let you become president. What is dangerous here is the turning away from anything any white American says. The reason for the political hesitation in spite of the Johnson landslide is the one who's been betrayed by American politicians for so long.
Let's pause here, Hayden.
And
And we're going to go to 3650.
It is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until the moment comes when we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it. And if that happens, it's a very grave moment for the West. Thank you.
We're going to pause here and move forward to Buckley. The audience there at the Student Union, which had over 700 people in that room, the largest audience they had ever had, gives Baldwin a standing ovation, which is just unheard of. They were so moved by his presentation. Now we will switch to Buckley, who has to argue the opposite side, that the resolution is wrong.
To establish a sentence here over his audience, which has clearly been so deeply moved.
Thank you, Mr.
by the
President.
eloquence and
Baldwin.
personal experience of the preceding speaker.
Aycock, Mr. Griffith, gentlemen. It seems to me that of all the indictments Mr. Baldwin has made of America, here tonight and in his copious literature of protest, the one that is most striking involves, in effect, the refusal of the American community to treat him other than as a Negro. The American community has refused to do this. The American community, almost everywhere he goes, treats him with the kind of unction, the kind of satisfaction at posturing carefully for his flagellations of our civilization, that indeed, quite properly, commands the contempt which he so eloquently showers upon us. It is impossible, in my judgment, to deal with the indictment of Mr. Baldwin unless one is prepared to deal with him as a white man. Unless one is prepared to say to him, the fact that your skin is black is utterly irrelevant to the arguments that you raise. The fact that you sit here, as is your rhetorical device, and lay the entire weight of the Negro ordeal on your own shoulders is irrelevant to the argument that we are here to discuss. The gravamen of Mr. Baldwin's charges against America are not so much that our civilization has failed him and his people, that our ideals are insufficient, but that we have no ideals, that our ideals rather are some sort of a superficial coating which we come up with at any given moment in order to justify whatever commercial and noxious experiment we are engaged in. Thus, Mr. Baldwin can write his book, The Fire Next Time, in which he threatens America. He didn't, in writing that book, speak with the British accents that he used exclusively tonight, in which he threatened America with the necessity for us to jettison our entire civilization. The only thing that the white man has that the Negro should want, he said, is power. And he is treated from coast to coast in the United States with a kind of unctuous
doesn't choose to give way. The interrupter must, and he has done. The interrupter now said down.
Goes beyond anything that was ever expected from the most servile Negro creature by a Southern family. I propose to pay him the honor this night of saying to him, Mr. Baldwin, I am going to speak to you without any reference whatever to those surrounding protections which you are used to in virtue of the fact that you are a Negro. And here we need to ask the question, what in fact shall we do about it, Mr. President? What shall we in America try to do, for instance, to eliminate those psychic humiliations which I join Mr. Baldwin in believing are the very worst aspects of this discrimination? You found it a source of considerable mirth to laugh away the statistics of my colleague, Mr. Murford. I don't think they are insignificant. They are certainly not insignificant in a world which attaches a considerable importance to material progress. It is, in fact, the case that 7/10 of the white income of the United States is equal to the income that is made by the average Negro. I don't think this is an irrelevant statistic, ladies and gentlemen. It takes a capitalization of $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 per job in the United States. This is a capitalization that was not created exclusively as a result of Negro travail. My great-grandparents worked too. Presumably yours worked also. I don't know of anything that has ever been created without the expense of something. All of you who hope for a diploma here are going to do that at the expense of a considerable amount of effort. And I would thank you, please, not to belie the fact that a considerable amount of effort went into the production of a system which grants a greater degree of material well-being to the American Negro than that is enjoyed by 95% of the other peoples of the human race. But even
Let's
so...
pause here, and we're going to move forward to 4719.
Now, if you get up to me and say... if you get up to me and say, well, now, is there the kind of concern that we students of Cambridge would show if the problem were our own? All I can say is I don't know. It may very well be that there has been some sort of a sunburst of moral enlightenment that has hit this community, so as to make it predictable that if you were the governors of the United States, the situation would change overnight. I'm prepared to grant this as a form of courtesy, Mr. President. But meanwhile, I am saying to you that the engines of concern in the United States are working. The presence of Mr. Baldwin here tonight is in part a reflection of that concern. You cannot go to a university in the United States, a university in the United States presumably also governed by the Lord spiritual as you are, in which Mr. Baldwin is not the toast of the town. You cannot go to a university of the United States in which practically all other problems of public policy are preempted by the primary policy of concern for the Negro. I challenge you to name me another civilization, anytime, anywhere in the history of the world, in which the problems of a minority, which have been showing considerable material and political advancement, is as much a subject of dramatic concern as it is in the United States. Let me just say finally, ladies and gentlemen, this. There is no instant cure for the race problem in America. And anybody who tells you that there is a charlatan and ultimately a boring man. Boring precisely because he is then speaking in the kind of abstractions that do not relate to the human experience. The trouble in America where the Negro community is concerned is a very complicated one. I urge those of you who have an actual rather than a purely ideologized interest in the problem to read the book Beyond the Melting Pot by Professor Glaser, also co-author of The Lonely Crowd, a prominent Jewish intellectual, who points to the fact that the situation in America where the Negroes are concerned is extremely complex as a result of an unfortunate conjunction of two factors. One is the dreadful efforts to perpetuate discrimination by many individual American citizens as a result of their lack of that final and ultimate concern which some people are truly trying to agitate. The other is as a result of the failure of the Negro community itself to make certain exertions which were made by other minority groups during the American experience. If you can stand a statistic not of my own making, let me give you one which Professor Glaser considers as relevant. He says, for instance, in 1900, there were 3,500 Negro doctors in America. In 1960, there were 3,900, an increase in 400. Is this because there were no opportunities, as has been suggested by Mr. Haycock and also by Mr. Baldwin implicitly? No, says Professor Glaser. There are a great many medical schools who are by no means practice discrimination, who are anxious to receive and to train Negro doctors. There are scholarships available to put them through, but in fact that particular energy, which he remarks was so noticeable in the Jewish community and to a certain and lesser extent in the Italian-Irish community, for some reason is not there. We should focus on the necessity to animate this particular energy, but he comes to the conclusion, which strikes me as plausible, that the people who can best do it, who can do it most effectively, are Negroes themselves. Let me conclude by reminding you, ladies and gentlemen, that where the Negro is concerned, the danger, as far as I can see at this moment, is that they will seek to reach out for some sort of radical solutions on the basis of which the true problem is obscured. They have done a great deal to focus on the fact of white discrimination against the Negroes. They have done a great deal to agitate a moral concern, but where, in fact, do they go now? They seem to be slipping, if you will read carefully, for instance, the words of Mr. Bayard Rustin, towards some sort of a Procrustean formulation which ends up less urging the advancement of the Negro than the regression of the white people. 14 times as many people in New York City born of Negroes are illegitimate as of whites. This is a problem. How shall we address it? By seeking out laws that encourage illegitimacy in white people? This, unfortunately, tends to be the rhetorical momentum that some of their arguments are taking.
One thing you might do, Mr. Buckley, is let them vote in Mississippi.
I agree. I agree. I couldn't agree with you more, and for except lest I appear too ingratiating, which is hardly my objective here tonight. I think actually what is wrong in Mississippi, sir, is not that not enough Negroes are voting, but that too many white people are voting. Booker T. Washington said that the important thing where Negroes are concerned is not that they hold public office, but that they be prepared to hold public office. Not that they vote, but that they be prepared to vote. What are we going to do with the Negroes, having taught the Negroes in Mississippi to despise Ross Barnett? Shall we then teach them to emulate their cousins in Harlem and adore Adam Clayton Powell, Jr.? It is much more complicated, sir, than simply the question of giving them the vote. If I were myself a constituent of the community of Mississippi at this moment, what I would do is vote to lift the standards of the vote so as to disqualify 65% of the white people who are presently voting. Not simply to give the... I say then that what we need is a considerable amount of frankness that acknowledges that there are two sets of difficulties. The difficulties of the white person who acts as white people and brown people and black people do all over the world to protect their own vested interests, who have, as all of the races in the entire world have, and suffer from a kind of a racial narcissism which tends always to convert every contingency into such a way as to maximize their own power. That, yes, we must do. But we must also reach through to the Negro people and tell them that their best chances are in a mobile society. And the most mobile society in the world today, my friends, is the United States of America. The most mobile society of the United States in the world is the United States of America, and it is precisely that mobility which will give opportunities to the Negroes which they must be encouraged to take. But they must not, in the course of their ordeal, be encouraged to adopt the kind of cynicism, the kind of despair, the kind of iconoclasm that is urged upon them by Mr. Baldwin in his recent works. Because of one thing, I can tell you, I believe with absolute authority, that where the United States is concerned, if it ever becomes a confrontation between a continuation of our own sort of idealism, the private stock of which, granted, like most people in the world, we tend to lavish only every now and then on public enterprises, reserving it so often for our own irritations and pleasures. But the fundamental friend of the Negro people in the United States is the good nature, and is the generosity, and is the good wishes, is the decency, the fundamental decency that do lie at the reserves of the spirit of the American people. These must not be laughed at, and under no circumstances must they be laughed at, and under no circumstances must America be addressed and told that the only alternative to the status quo is to overthrow that civilization which we consider to be the faith of our fathers, the faith indeed of your fathers. This is what must animate whatever meliorism must come, because if it does finally come to a confrontation, a radical confrontation between giving up what we understand to be the best features of the American way of life, which at that level is indistinguishable, so far as I can see, from the European way of life, then we will fight the issue. And we will fight the issue not only in the Cambridge Union, but we will fight it, as you were once recently called to do, on beaches and on hills and on mountains and on landing grounds. And we will be convinced that just as you won the war against a particular threat to civilization, you were nevertheless waging a war in favor of and for the benefit of Germans, your own enemies, just as we are convinced that if it should ever come to that kind of a confrontation, our own determination to win the struggle will be a determination to wage a war not only for whites, but also for Negroes.
Maybe we can halt it now. And if we can go back to my screen. Okay, that, as I said, is a somewhat edited, somewhat abridged version of the debate, but it gives you the overall feel for what went on there. As I told you at the onset, Baldwin was going to personalize it, and he was going to give his position from his own life experience as a Black man in America. Baldwin, one of the things he had done in his life when he was young, his stepfather was a part-time preacher, and the family was very, very religious. And Baldwin, for about 3 years during his adolescence, actually became a preacher himself, a youth preacher. And I think that's where he, you can sort of see it in his style of speaking and how he raises his voice in different places and how he pulls upon, certain biblical influences. We talked at the beginning of his speech about being in the position of a Jeremiah, from the book of Jeremiah, the prophet who's telling people what's going to happen to them because they have not followed God. And he actually has that language in there when he talks about, I did all this work, I picked the cotton, I plowed the fields, all of this being for nothing. And if you look at Jeremiah, there's that language in there about woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness and his chambers by wrong, that useth his neighbor's service without wages and giveth him not for his work. I said, yep, he went right to the Bible. He would have had somebody stand up there and say that's Jeremiah 22:13 when he gave that kind of a statement. And his passion really sort of ruled the day there. Ultimately, the individuals in the room, the way this debate was set up, they got to vote by what door they exited the debate room on, whether or not it was in favor of the resolution that Baldwin had argued or in favor of the opposition that Buckley had argued. And in the final tally, there were 544 votes for Baldwin's side and only 164 for Buckley. Buckley wasn't pleased. He believed that the audience had not prepared themselves by reading the essays of Baldwin and understanding his point that what Baldwin was basically trying to do was tear down all the institutions that made America great, and in saying that America had no ideals and no morals. But he still took pride in participating in this debate, even though this wasn't a debate where he was going to make any money. And it was one in which there was some sacrifice to him in going to, because just maybe it was a week before the debate, his wife had been in a skiing accident. They had been on their annual retreat to Switzerland, and she had broken her leg in 5 places and then developed pleurisy. And he basically left her bedside to come to this debate and flew back to her bedside the next day. Now, she lived for decades after that, so she did recover. But I think you also could pick up in Buckley's comments to it. Again, this sort of what I would characterize as condescending approach to the Black problem. Basically, that Black people needed to pick themselves up more by their bootstraps, giving those quotes about the number of doctors and that we hadn't gotten more doctors and we needed to do more of that. Although if you read more of Buckley's writing, you'll find that Buckley never really thought of himself as a racist, even though his magazine, the New Republic, was one that supported segregation and did not support the Voting Rights Act and didn't believe that the federal government should be involved in any local offenses. But he took sort of an elitist approach that went beyond race. He believed basically there was a sort of a class situation in America, that there were certain individuals based on their culture, based on their breeding, based on their education, who were in a better position to make decisions for the common person than the common person were. So, I mean, that's why you have those comments by him where he refers to when the person says, the first thing you should do is let people vote in Mississippi. And he says the problem is that there are too many white people voting in Mississippi. And that if he had his way, he would make the requirements for voting even higher to keep those individuals from voting. He believed that if, at least at that time, he believed that left to their own devices, the local governments, the state governments, would do right by their people, and that basically the Black people just had to hurry up and wait, which was sort of the gradualism that Martin Luther King had talked about in his I Have a Dream speech, that we no longer wanted to wait. It was time for things to change. And obviously in the 60s, as I said in the onset, those were turbulent times. There were many riots. There were many people who continued to be discriminated against, who continued to be hurt as this pain was brought to the surface, and there was not mass agreement as to everything, as to what the appropriate approach was to deal with these problems. One of the comments that Baldwin actually makes, and I don't know if this made it into the videotape, it's in the transcript, when he said that, there are people out there who, they won't listen to me, being Baldwin, and they're not going to listen to Martin Luther King either. And you are going to have to deal with them. And his belief that, the party that was in control, not the party, the people who were in control, the people who had the power, had to accept their history. It was the only way things were ever going to change, not by ignoring it. And so the fact that he was able to sort of hit the nail right on the head with this audience and basically call out white supremacy, and to say to these, young British men and women, you know what, it started with you there in Europe and you brought it over here to the United States. And this horrible myth that, this portion of the population is just inherently superior to another based solely on color is just wrong. And that we need to recognize that we are all members of this community, we're all Americans, and that we are not wards or under missionary care, and that we don't have to rely, as Buckley argues so eloquently, about the generosity of spirit of the majority in the United States, but then has his threat at the end that if their institutions are challenged, that he takes on that sort of Churchill kind of speech, we will basically fight to the end. We'll never give up. It just seemed to me that this is a very, very fascinating debate, and that the issues that are in it, you can't just look at it and say, yeah, that was 1965. We don't have any problems anymore. There isn't still this sort of classism, racism in the United States. I think those of us, particularly here, living here in Florida, see that these things are still rearing their heads, and that the answer isn't hide your head in the sand. The answer has to be people of goodwill continuing to listen to each other and to learn from each other.
Alvin, I'm going to
yes.
ask you to pause for 1 minute, because we need to stop the recording so that we
Go
can
right ahead.
save the hour program, but I want you to continue. So David, if you'll go ahead and just stop the recording, we'll go ahead. And I did not see any questions in the chat at all. I wanted to alert everybody that in the chat is the link to the entire video. So if you copy that, you can watch the entire video.